Okay, so what I want to talk about is a long debate over who do they think was better or who had a better plan for blacks between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. This should be completely obvious at this point that Martin Luther King had a far greater plan than Malcolm X ever could have dreamed of. But we're gonna go over it today. We're gonna go over the ingeniousness of Dr. Martin Luther King and how smart he was, and about his psychological manipulation and his psychological war playing on the moral compass of white America with a Christian background. So, Martin Luther King had a doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University. So, he understood psychological tactics of victory. Martin Luther King was a very, very smart man. He always carefully coded his words. Always. This man knew complete psychological manipulation and warfare. So the whole so-called peaceful protest things, he knew a lot about that. Trust me. He was not a complete hot-headed person. He knew you have to go into things with a cold and calculated plan to get results, not going near hot at the spur of the moment and think that something is going to happen. So on March 25th, 1965, Martin Luther King led thousands of nonviolent demonstrators to the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, after a 5-day, 54-mile march from Selma, Alabama, where local African Americans and the Student of Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had been campaigning for voter rights. King told the assembled crowd, "There never was a moment in American history more honorable and more inspiring than the pilgrimage of clergymen and laymen of every race and faith pouring into Selma to face danger at the side of its embattled Negroes." So King, he rallied up all of these people for a great display. On January 2nd, 1965, King and the SCLC joined the SNCC, the Dallas County Voters League, and other local African American activists in a voting rights campaign in Selma, where, in spite of repeated registration attempts by local blacks, only 2% were on the voting rolls. C excuse me, SCLC had chosen to focus its efforts in Selma, where they anticipated that the notorious brutality of the local law enforcement under Sheriff Jim Clark would attract national attention and pressure President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress to enact new national voting rights legislation. Let's read that again. Remember earlier I told you he had a doctorate degree in systematic theology? He knows psychological warfare on how to play on the moral compass of people. They carefully chose Selma because there's a notorious racist law enforcement sheriff, Jim Clark, down there who they knew would do something crazy if all these black people came down there. And the plan was to bring all the all the blacks down there, have all the cameras on them, and watch this racist honky do something crazy, which was going to pressure and get the attention of President Lyndon B. Johnson. To when there he would be forced to do something after seeing this. This plan is this is a genius plan that only Martin Luther King could have thought of. Television coverage of Bloody Sunday and the event became known, triggered national outrage. Lewis, who was severely beaten on the head, "I don't see how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam." I don't see how he can send troops to the Congo. I don't see how he can send troops to Africa and can't send troops to Selma. And keep in mind, like, people died behind this. People say that this was non-violent, and people was down there dying for this. He's this man. Uh, he was shot by a state trooper, a 26-year-old deacon from Marion, as he attempted to protect his mother from the trooper's nightstick. People died behind this, man. We should have a lot more respect for Martin Luther King and Bloody Sunday and all the March and Selma than we should. This younger generation just doesn't know anything and doesn't have any respect. People died behind this, man. In order to get the rights that we have today, people had to die behind this. So, following the events of Bloody Sunday, Dr. King, being the genius that he is, that evening King began a blitz of telegrams and public statements calling on religious leaders from all over the nation to join us on Tuesday in our peaceful, nonviolent march for freedom. While King and the Selma activists made plans to retry the march again 2 days later, Federal District Court Judge Frank M. Johnson notified movement attorney Fred Gray that he intended to issue a restraining order prohibiting the march until at least March 11th, and President Johnson pressured King to call off the march until the federal court order could provide protection to the marchers. Forced to consider whether to obey the pending court order after consulting late into the night and early morning with other civil rights leaders and John Doerr, the deputy chief of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, King proceeded to the Edmund Peters Bridge on that afternoon of March 9th. March 9th. He led more than 2,000 marchers, including hundreds of clergy who had answered King's call on short notice to the site on Sunday's attack. Then stopped and asked them to kneel and pray. After prayers, they rose and turned the march back to Selma, avoiding another confrontation with state troopers and skirting the issue of whether to obey Judge Johnson's court order. Many marchers were critical of King's unexpected decision to not push onto Montgomery, but the restraint gained support from President Johnson, who issued the public statement. Americans everywhere joined in deploring the brutality with which a number of Negro citizens of Alabama were treated when they sought to dramatize their deep and sincere interest in attaining a precious right to vote. So what Martin Luther King is doing here is playing on the moral compass of President Lyndon B. Johnson. He's now gaining favoritism and sympathy from President Lyndon B. Johnson. So when Lyndon B. Johnson told him not to do it, he doesn't do it to strengthen the friendship. Because Martin Luther King, he already has him where he wanted. They did the march down to Selma for Bloody Sunday, and now the whole world has saw how Black people are being mistreated by troops and sheriffs down there, which has gained the attention of President Lyndon B. Johnson, to where now President Lyndon B. Johnson is going to be forced to do something after seeing this, because this has sparked national outrage. These people aren't doing nothing, just standing there, just walking, and they're being beat in the head with clubs and sprayed with fire hoses and shit. So now this has sparked national outrage, so the president has to do something. This plan is ingenious. So on March 15th, President Johnson addressed Congress, identifying himself with the demonstrators in Selma in a televised address. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. So following this is a address that Lyndon B. Johnson has made to the public as the president. During the final rally held on the steps of the Capitol of Montgomery, King proclaimed, "The end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with this, uh, whatever that word is, conscience, and that will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be a day of man as man." Afterwards, a delegation of marchers led, afterwards, a delegation of march leaders attempted to deliver a petition to Governor Wallace, but were rebuffed. That night, while ferrying Selma demonstrators back home from Montgomery, Viola Louisa, a white woman from Michigan who had come to Alabama to volunteer, was shot and killed by 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan. Dorr later prosecuted 3 Klansmen for conspiring to violate her civil rights. And a lot of people saw this played out in, what was that movie, Mississippi Burning? This white woman, she was going down there to the march, and she was in the car with some black men, some other voters, and those country honky ass Ku Klux Klan members down there. They stopped them on the road and ended up shooting her. Called her a nigger lover and this and that. On August the 6th, in the presence of King and other civil rights leaders, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, recalling the outrage in Selma. Johnson called the right to vote the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and to destroy the terrible walls which imprison men because they are different from other men. In his annual address to the SCLC a few days later, King noted that Montgomery led to the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960. Birmingham inspired the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Selma produced the voting rights legislation of 1965. So here you have it. All of the peaceful marchings and the non-violent tactics of Martin Luther King that everybody says he was so stupid for ended up getting laws passed for us. We are able to reap the benefits that we are today because of his acts, because of his actions, because of his strategic plans, specifically, not Malcolm X, but because of Martin Luther King's strategic plans have led to rights being passed for us. He knew exactly what he was doing from the start. He was playing on the psychological, moral compass of the president, and it worked. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was trained in college for this. Okay, and this is just another sort of law that Martin Luther King had have something to do with getting passed. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But King's murder on April 4th in Memphis, Tennessee changed the calculus for passage, igniting a week of intense debate in the House over the fate of the legislation as riots spread through cities across America. On Friday, April 5th, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent a letter to the Speaker, John McCormick of Massachusetts, asking him to bring this bill to a vote as soon as possible in order to show the nation that its leaders were acting on civil rights issues championed by King. So there were riots after King's death, and with President Lyndon B. Johnson being on King's side after seeing what he did, and the riots after King, he decided to keep helping what Martin Luther King would have wanted. So he ended up passing another law in light of issues championed by King, as he says right here. So, right here, we're going to clear something else up. Martin Luther King was not as non-violent as you think. Martin Luther King carried the pistol. He had all kind of weapons in his home. He was just strategic about his protests. In 1956, Montgomery bus boycott, the campaign that first established King's national reputation, was not planned in advance as the Gandhian-style campaign of nonviolence resistance. So when King went on the campaign of boycotts, which excuse me. So all of the campaigns of the boycott campaigns that King led in Montgomery had nothing to do with him studying Gandhi. At this time, he had not even took the pilgrimage to India and knew much about Gandhian style campaigns. So here you read, at the time, King would not have had a clear sense of strategic principles behind such a campaign. Rather, the bus boycott came together quickly in the wake of Rosa Parks' arrest in late 1955, taking inspiration from a similar action in Baton Rouge in 1953. And even before that, it was the baseball player Jackie Robinson. He also did a bus boycott where he refused to move to another seat, and he actually pulled out his pistol. So this actually happened a few times before Rosa Parks. But King was a newcomer to Montgomery. He was unexpectedly thrust into the leadership of the movement, chosen in part because he was not identified with any of the established factions among the city's prominent blacks. Soon he was receiving phone calls on which unidentified voices warned, "Listen, nigger, we've taken all we can from you. Before next week, you'll be sorry you ever came to Montgomery." After such death threats resulted in the bombings of King's home of February 1956. The response reflected King's still tentative embrace of the theory and practice of nonviolence. In his talks before mass meetings, King preached a Christian injunction to love thy enemy. Having read Thoreau, or however you say that, in college, he described the bus boycott as an act of passive non-cooperation, and regularly called for passive resistance. But King did not use the term nonviolence, and he admitted that he knew little about Gandhi or the Indian independence leaders' campaigns. So here's where we're going to get in about how Martin Luther King carried the pistol. And Martin Luther King was not against guns by any means necessary. He was against bringing guns to protest. So following King moving to Montgomery and his house being bombed and all that, he feared that the Klan was targeting him for assassination. William Worthy, a journalist who covered the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, reported that once during a visit to King's parsonage, he went to sit down on an armchair in the living room, and to his surprise, almost sat on a loaded gun. Glenn Smiley, an advisor to King, described King's home as an arsenal. So after King moved to Montgomery and getting all the death threats and his house being burned, King was strapped. His house was like an arsenal. He had all weapons ready to go. And so again, this is one of King's last speeches, where he's saying we're coming to get our check. Now, while I can't say specifically this is the reason why he was targeted for assassination by the FBI, but we can say that this they definitely probably was scared of him. after this speech. Martin Luther King had all at this time he had already shown that he was very capable of strategically planning and getting things done. So he definitely was on their list. He had shown time and time over and led successful campaigns showing that he could get change done in his favor of his cause. A memorandum from the FBI through the Freedom of Information Act actually stated that Dr. Martin Luther King was killed for two things, as stated by Judge Joe Brown. And those two things were galvanizing the anti war movement and two, revitalizing the labor movement. King was that's what he was on the FBI's radar for. You know, they would say he was his church was a communist front, and all of these things put him on the list. So Dr. Martin Luther King was a major player. He was a complete threat. He was very much a threat to white racist America. So there you have it. So right here, now we're going to talk about Malcolm X. A lot of people say Malcolm X was better than Martin Luther King. No, in the hell he wasn't. Stop it. Malcolm X had his his plan was stupid. It never would have worked. He had to plan the psychology of an angry child. A lot of times he would disrespect Martin Luther King. I feel he would Martin Malcolm X he wasn't educated enough to understand Martin Luther King. He was not on Martin Luther King's level of education or just in terms of understanding psychological warfare. There is no comparison. Here's a few things that Malcolm X would say about Martin Luther King. Some nasty things. Malcolm X kind of had a nasty mouth sometimes. He talked a lot. As far as the apostle of nonviolence, for years Malcolm showed him nothing but scorn. King was a fool, a modern day Uncle Tom. And his march, where King gave his celebrated speech, just a farce on Washington. The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach Negroes how to be defenseless. And the Christianity that motivated King was the white man's religion. For his part, civil rights leader Thurgood Marshall called the Nation of Islam a bunch of thugs organized from prisons and jails and financed, I'm sure, by some Arab group. King himself took to the higher road, rarely criticizing Malcolm as the smarter and educated man should. Let's repeat that. King took the higher road than Malcolm by rarely criticizing Malcolm, but also refusing to publicly debate him. King will not debate his secretary, told Malcolm, because he has always considered his work in a positive action framework rather than engaging in consistent negative debates. See, Malcolm X was a jailhouse Muslim revert, one of those people who read a bunch of books in prison and come out and think they smart. He wasn't taught in like Ivy League universities and stuff like Martin Luther King. He didn't have that same education. He didn't have that same type of intellect as Martin Luther King. Malcolm X was just a angry young man who preached how he wanted change through violence. Always criticizing Martin Luther King, wanted to debate, just anything for likes and attention. But Martin Luther King, being the smarter, more mature man that he would not engage in such debates that would just lower his character. Martin Luther King debating with someone like Malcolm X, and these type of negative debates would be below him. So while they didn't actually debate, apparently they were on the same broadcast together where Malcolm X kind of tried to lure him into a debate. And Martin Luther King, being the genius that he is, he always carefully coded his words, always spoke properly, cool and calm and collective. Malcolm X he just had a big mouth and he talked too much. And that's what ended up getting him killed.
The bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attacks of the Klan in that day.
I don't think of love as, in this context, as emotional bosh. I don't think of it as a weak force, but I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. Now, this is what I try to teach in the struggle in the South, that we are not engaged in a struggle that means we sit down and do nothing. That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and bedlam complacency, wherein non-violent resistance means that you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics, fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with nonviolence.
The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Did you catch that from Martin Luther King being the educated man that he is? He's basically saying that some of the critics of his movements are too stupid to realize the ingeniousness of it. Basically saying they're too stupid and low-minded to understand the strategic ingeniousness of it. So let's get in. So now that we've covered what now that we've covered what Dr. Martin Luther King has done and accomplished for blacks, getting 3 laws passed as opposed to Malcolm X. What did Malcolm X do for blacks? Well, after Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam, he funded 2 organizations. He funded the Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization for Afro Unity or something. Basically, Malcolm X never really did anything for blacks besides give a bunch of feel-good speeches and talk about racism, basically, and about how we need to separate from America, which would have been it would not have been successful. That would have been a very stupid plan. We would have ended up in the same situation as Haiti is in today, but that's another topic for a different video. So what is these organizations that Malcolm X was trying to do for black people that was so important? Well, this one organization, the Muslim Mosque, a lot of people say he was doing so much for black people, but he was actually doing something for not all black people, but only for Muslims specifically. So if you are a black Christian or whatever, I'm sorry, you cannot benefit from Malcolm X. Also in August, the MMI was admitted to the Islamic Federation of the United States and Canada. The following month, the World Islamic League offered 15 scholarships through MMI to study at the Islamic University of Medina in Saudi Arabia. So this is an organization this is what Malcolm X wanted for blacks. Malcolm X just wanted for all blacks to become Muslims and go and go over to the Middle East and kiss some Arab ass, just like he was doing. That's basically what he was doing. Malcolm X talking about how Martin Luther King was a Uncle Tom and Christianity is the white man's religion. Well, Islam is the Arab's religion. So what's the difference? You see, you claim that Martin Luther King was kissing white ass, and okay, well, Malcolm X was kissing Arab ass. So what's the difference? All Malcolm X wanted to do was turn all black people into Muslims and have them over there kissing Arab ass and shaking hands with all the Middle Eastern Arabs and all the Africans and promoting Pan Africanism. That's all he wanted. Malcolm X had his plan was very childish. It never would have succeeded. It seemed like it wasn't even thoroughly planned out, as history has shown. And it's just silly. And anybody would compare him to Martin Luther King. And not to really down Malcolm X, but this is no comparison to the geniuses of Dr. Martin Luther King. Okay, here's the other group that Malcolm X funded, the Organization of Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was basically a Pan-Africanist organization funded by Malcolm X in 1964. It was modeled after the Organization of African Unity, which had impressed Malcolm X during his visit to Africa in 1964. The purpose of this was to fight for human rights of African Americans and promote cooperation among Africans and people of African descent in Americas. So basically, this is just some a Pan African organization. Just it really has no merit, no real logical aim. It's just to sort of like go back to Africa and learn the ways and become unity, which is stupid because it would never work because Africa is their fundamentals are on tribal unity and family. So, all those countries in Africa, along with the diaspora, unifying is one of the stupidest things I ever heard in my life, to be quite frank with you. But that's that. So this is really nothing, just some Pan-African stuff. So that's about it. And so for a lot of people who kept saying, well, Malcolm X was about war and violence. Well, not really. I mean, that's what he says, but what did he actually do? Now we know that Malcolm X was cold. He wasn't scared. He went against the Nation of Islam, wouldn't retract his words even after being threatened, having his house firebombed, and he was ready to die. So I'll give him that. He was tough. But I mean, I don't know. In this situation in the Malcolm X movie, when he led the big group of men to the police precinct and he talked to the deputy or whatever, and then he escorted all the men back as depicted or over dramatically depicted in the Spike Lee movie. I mean, if he was so about action or whatever, then I mean, they could have just had to squabble with the Harlem police precinct right then and there. If he was really with it or he really meant what he said, but he didn't. The deputy told them to get these people out of here, and Malcolm got the people out of here. So how can he really call people Uncle Tom or stepping fetching when he listened to that police deputy at the Harlem precinct in the movie, which was that really happened in real life? He told him to take his men and get out of here, and he did. After it, of course, Malcolm, he wanted for the man who was beaten by the police officers to be released or to know if he was okay. Yeah, but well, I don't know. I'm just saying. It seemed like they had the chance to squabble with the police precinct right then and there and didn't take it. But we all know the Nation of Islam. They won't really do anything to a white person. But if it's a black person who says something against them, you better watch out. So y'all have a good day.